Over the past few years, I've gotten into canning. I've canned a lot of tomatoes. And I found I don't have a good place to store all the jars. I have little collections all over the house. What I've been thinking is if you go through the family room and you sneak through the craft room, there's the room we call the wayback room, which is sort of the last room in the basement. And there's a wall on the outside edge of the house that I've managed to clear a space around. What I've been thinking is I can make a thin system of shelves that could hold the jars that I've been using to can, mostly tomatoes. So my thought is to make a set of 5 bays, and each bay will have a vertical side, then a series of shelves that span between those two sides. And I've set it up where they'll be just wide enough for a quart jar and just long enough for 6 jars to sit on each shelf. And then once the jars are in place on a particular shelf, I'll have a system of clips that will hold a bar that will run across the shelf to hold the jars in place. I was wondering about what wood to use for this project. And I was thinking about either buying something or trying to find something that I already had. There was this tree that fell on our house last winter. I did a whole video about this adventure of this storm. And we had this tree removed, and I had them leave me some lengths of the trunk so I could mill up the wood into something usable. And I was thinking it's been a full summer, and maybe the wood's dry enough to use. I'm thinking this project's going to be kind of more on the level of lumber and less on the level of fine furniture, so maybe it doesn't have to be completely dry.
4 to 6 weeks later.
Once they brought the tree down, I was able to slab the logs to movable pieces. And they've been sitting and drying since last winter, basically, so almost a year. But more importantly, through a hot, dry summer. I tested some of the pieces for moisture, and they were kind of in the 12 to 16%. So they're still a little on the wet side, but I think it'll be okay. It's just pine, so it shouldn't move a whole lot as it dries some more. The big thing with this milling project was I finally put a winch on my chainsaw mill, which helped immensely. It helped in being able to slab logs with the chainsaw by myself. The winch takes the place of the second person. I had stacked these nicely. Then late this last summer, we had another similar tree taken out. It was next to our carport. And I did the same thing where I had them leave me longer sections of the trunk so I could slab up that wood as well. So I had put that wood on top of this wood, not thinking I was going to use this so soon.
Several months later.
So now it's time to start working on the actual project, and I need to take that younger or newer, wetter wood off the top of my stack and get at the slabs that are on the bottom. What was nice about using this is I cleared up some space in our carport. It's becoming more and more full of stacks of wood. And I could bring the wood around to the shop and over to the bandsaw. And I need to cut these pieces into smaller strips. And I know I'm going to get the comment that I'm cutting up these beautiful slabs into little pieces. But I want to remind everyone that every single piece of wood once was part of a beautiful live edge slab. So wood has to come from somewhere. It's safer to do the first cuts of these slabs on the bandsaw as compared to the table saw. The piece doesn't have to be perfectly flat, and there's no edge on the slab to run against the table saw fence. The first thing I'm making are the vertical pieces for the shelving units. I cut the strips the full length out of the slabs, and then I was noticing the ends really had a lot of bend to them. I think it was kind of the way my chainsaw was coming out of the log, so I'd get a little bend right at the end. I was making sure I had at least 8 feet, as that's the height of the room, I cut off that little bend. When I joint the piece, I don't have to take off as much material to get to a flat face. And I did one edge. And once I had a flat face and a flat edge, I could run the pieces through the planer. The goal here is to then get a flat face on both sides, then run the piece through the bandsaw again and split it in half and get two pieces out of each one of these pieces. And if I have a flat face on each side, I can then replane each of those two new pieces using that original flat face and planing the cut surface flat. So this was just a lot of cutting and joining and planing. I could then cut these to a final width using that jointed edge that I made earlier. This will mean I will have a little bit less to cut through on the bandsaw, and I can cut off any defects at this point. I went back to measure again, make sure I had the right length. Also, in the end, what I did is I made each of the bays as a cabinet, and I brought those in as a finished piece and installed those in place. So it really goes together more like this animation. I drew a line down the center, and I can cut these in half on the bandsaw. I found with this saw, it's easier to draw a line and eyeball the cut, or it seems to be more accurate than to make a fence and try and hold the piece against the fence. The blade seems to wander a bit, and I don't know if my guides just aren't tuned correctly or the blade isn't sharp enough or quite what the problem is. It seems to cut okay, it's just sometimes it just doesn't cut very straight. So I have to sort of do it manually and make sure it's staying straight. So with 5 bays, I needed to make 10 of these vertical pieces. I also filled my dust bin in about 2 days on this project because I was doing so much joining and planing. Even with the new Lux Cut head that I have that makes smaller chips, I was making a lot of sawdust. Then I cut the shelves, which will be out of similar pieces to the vertical sections. They'll just be shorter. I can cut the first piece a little bit long and get a nice square cut on that end, and then turn the piece around and trim up the other end at the right length. So both ends are nice and square and cut properly. Then I marked where I wanted my dados to go for the shelves. I set them so the shelves would be just a little taller than the jar. Then I can cut the dados on the radial arm saw. I haven't used this saw too much, but it's good for bigger projects like this. I didn't quite have enough width in the saw blade to do the dado that I wanted to do. So I had to carefully make the size, or the width, I guess, of each dado, which slowed it down a little bit, but it wasn't too bad. I had a block, sort of a cutoff from one of the shelves that was the right width. So I could test to make sure the shelves were going to fit in the dados, and I could use that as sort of a handle to push the piece back and forth to get the cut in the right place. Once I had the sides cut with the dados, I could put the shelves in. Now, one little bit of logic that I was following was to do all of the attachment in the shop would be done with nails and glue, a little more permanent, and all of the attaching in the house would be done with screws. So I could put things together, and if things weren't working out right or it's going to change my mind, I could make changes. The smaller details are with glue and nails, and the bigger details, sort of the bigger parts going together, is with screws. I had thought I would make some horizontal bars across the back of each of the shelves, one to add some support for the shelf, and one to provide sort of a barrier between the jars and the concrete wall. But what I ended up doing that seemed a lot simpler was to just go buy some 1/4-inch plywood and use that as the back. As then I could have something that would hold the piece square and it would protect the jars from the concrete, and it would give some structure to the shelves. So I marked where my shelves were, so I'll know where to put a nail into, or a staple, I guess is what I'm using here, into the back. I can put glue down. One little pro tip is to start the glue further away from yourself, and then glue what's closest to you last, so you're not getting glue on your shirt. And I can just put the piece in place. With the plywood, all of a sudden I was making a monolithic thing that wasn't going to have any give when I was installing these in the basement. So I was much more careful about making sure they were square and making sure the sides were straight. If the sides aren't straight, then I'll have gaps between the different boxes. And if they're not square, I'll have spaces at the bottom where they're not sitting flat on the floor. In the end, they were close enough. Now I need to figure out how to make a piece at the top that attaches to the ceiling and I can attach the top of the shelving unit to, and a piece at the floor that I can attach to the floor and attach the bottom of the shelving unit to. Sort of like a header and a footer. So I got a 2x4 for the floor, and I got a 2x10 for the ceiling. I thought I should just go get some lumber for this and not use the pine, as I was starting to get kind of low on the amount of wood that I had. And this felt more like the lumbery part of this project. I had a pipe down at the left end in this view, which is why there's a little angle at the end of the 2x10. And I got a little help putting this up. I wanted to make sure my cabinets were going to fit before I screwed these in place, just in case I had to plane off some more of this wood, but it fit fine. And I wanted to figure out where the bottom and the top would be to make sure the piece is vertical from the wall. So once I had it figured out and I knew what the dimensions were, I could attach the piece to the floor. I had some small concrete screws that I used, and I've got a drill that will go into concrete pretty easily if it's not too big. And these screws really don't have to hold a whole lot. They just need to keep the piece from sliding away or towards the wall. It feels like they'll work just fine for that. So the idea with installing these is that the bottom will be set pretty tight, as I'll just screw the bottom to that piece that I just attached. And then the top will be where I'll take up the slop in the size of the cabinet and the size of the room. So I can move the pieces in and out from the wall and attach them where they need to be so they're vertical. And I'll have a little bit of movement in the way I'm going to attach the top. So the cabinets don't have to be exactly the right length. They can be a little bit short. My idea for attaching the top is to make another shelf piece, but it won't sit in a dado. But I can attach that piece to the top plate in the ceiling, then attach that new shelf piece to the vertical pieces on the cabinet. I can get all of the connections nice and tight, but the shelf piece doesn't have to extend all the way to the ceiling. I was also attaching the vertical sides to each other as well. I put up the piece on the right side first, then started mounting each of the successive shelf pieces along the wall. That first piece was sort of the anchor piece, and then I could base the rest of it off of that. I should probably put a piece of trim running right across the top, but I haven't done that. You can see sort of how that pipe comes under the plane of the ceiling. That's how the shelving units look installed. I can start to make the clips that are going to sit on the face of that shelving unit. I needed some kind of system that you could open and close easily that would hold the jars in place in case there's a small earthquake or the cats jump up and play around with stuff or something. So I made another piece similar to the shelf pieces. I cut that into shorter pieces and there'll be one of these at each end of each shelf. And I figured out the width of the bracket or the bar piece that's going to hold the jars in place. And I need to cut a rabbet that sits at the top of this bracket piece that I'm making. I thought about using something more like a French cleat for this joint, but the bar that runs across holding the jars won't really have any weight on it, so I'm not sure the French cleat system would really work all that well. I think it would work, it just might not be as good as it could be. What I ended up with is something that's two rabbets that go together. I was thinking about how I was going to put these in place, and I thought of a jig I could make. So I got some scrap pieces, and I measured on the longer section on this piece where the vertical supports were in the shelving system, and I added some little sort of pieces. And the idea is to put this under the shelf, clamp the little pieces I added to the shelf, and that gives me a little tiny shelf to put the bracket on. If I do that for all of them, they should all be in the same location relative to the shelf. And they seem to work pretty well. I had thought I'd want it longer, but it was kind of nice having it half the width of the complete unit. So I could do one side and then do the other side. And it was just a lot of screws at this point. And I tested to make sure a jar would still fit, and it was perfect. It was time to put the jars on the shelf. I need to make the bars that will run across the shelves to hold the jars in place now. So I cut square pieces for this. Then I could cut those pieces to length, clean up the first end, then cut the piece to length. And once I have the pieces made, I can put a ravet in the end. And this will fit in the ravet that's in the clip, or the bracket that's on the shelving unit. And I don't know if I screwed up. I think the way I did the brackets was I did a full width bracket on the ends, and it sits inside the shelf. So what that means is I have a set of these bars that I'm making where the ravets on the end have to be bigger. I'm kind of thinking now maybe I should have cut those brackets in half, and then all of my bars would have been the same. I don't know, that's how it is. Now I have a place for all of my jars and all of my canned goods. I'm hoping I'll do more next year and I can fill this out a little better. We can also use this for other small things. It doesn't have to just be jars. But it is really nice having everything in one place. Thanks for watching.